Before getting started, I want to point out that I have had these little tiny LEDs from the Tiny's LED company for months now, and I have just not realized that I had them because my builds look like crap because I'm always testing everything. I don't really pay attention to aesthetics or making things look amazing because it's going to be ripped apart in the next battery, so I just don't pay attention to these things so much. But I plugged them in and they are so freaking incredibly bright. They look amazing. Just wanted to point that out because if you are building a toothpick or something, you know, bling things out, these things weigh like not even 0.2 grams each, and so it's just the wiring that you have to do that takes time, but it looks awesome and it's so super bright. Also, I have this frame, which is a 47 gram 5-inch frame. It's a molded carbon frame from Airpunk RC. I'm going to be building that sometime in the future when I get around to it. I'm just incredibly busy right now. Also, I want to point out that this is the 1202 motor from RCN Power, and I have tested 7 or 8 different 1202 motor products, and while it's really hard to test motors across company lines because the construction is just so variable, in this case I'm pretty confident that the 1202 size is just not useful for pretty much anything as far as I have tested. It's not good for a whoop, it's not good for 65mm, it's not good for 75mm, it's not good for 3-inch, not good for multi-blade. It just doesn't have the power, and it has very, very low efficiency. So I wanted to point this out because I do know that there's probably going to be 4 or 5 1202 motors on the market sometime soon. I would discourage anybody from even bothering trying them because of the things I found. Of course, do your own testing, but I'm just sharing my experience with these things. So what I'm going to talk about today is, or right now, is all of the, not all of them, but a lot of the 3-inch props that I have tested for my toothpick class, and just basically the props, how they perform, because it really does make quite a significant difference on the quad's performance. And starting with the Gemfan 3025, and also I have to point out that these are not all the props in the category. There's obviously a lot more 3-inch props in this category. I have tested a lot of them. I just couldn't find them in my box to bring out here and test, so I'm just going to talk about the ones that I have right here in front of me because I did fly them all recently, and so I have a fresh idea of how they perform and I can articulate them without too much trouble right now before I forget things. Anyways, let's start with the 3025 prop from Gemfan, and this prop has been around for quite some time. It actually comes in a tri-blade as well. It weighs, 2 of them together weigh 2 grams. So this is actually, I think, the heaviest prop of the group. And that's interesting because this King Kong 75mm prop that's relatively new is really thick. And I would expect it to be heavier, but it's not. This is the heaviest prop, even though the blades are very, very skinny and flimsy. And this is a 25 pitch blade. I think this is actually the steepest pitch of all of the props. And these little tiny micro props, they tend to have a really shallow pitch because they're spinning really fast. So that pitch does a lot over a number of RPM. And so the characteristics of this prop, it's really hard to predict how these things are going to perform. So you really just have to test them in the real world. And also, everything I say, take it with a grain of salt because it really matters the quad that you put it on. The weight of the quad really makes a significant difference. On this prop, you actually get a lot of power down low. You get a lot of power out of the motor, out of the system. However, it's a very slippery prop. I have no idea why it's so slippery, but it just feels like it has super lacking control throughout the throttle range in the control department, not necessarily the throttle department. If you have a heavier quad, I would maybe consider the tri-blade version of this prop, even though it's not particularly efficient or particularly good at anything, but it has been a prop that we've had for a long time, and it's done an okay-ish job over this long period of time. The durability is decent. I mean, it is a polycarbonate material, so it's going to hold up okay. That also heavily depends on what quad you put it on and its all-up weight, because having a higher all-up weight will tend to bend and break props much easier. Moving on to the HQ3x2 prop. This is a really, really nice prop by HQ. I'm really happy, I was really thrilled to see this prop come out because it is a really nice prop. And let's weigh it. So I weigh 2 of them at a time because it's hard to get an accurate weight on one. This is 1.8 grams, so that makes them 0.9 grams a piece. And so this prop has pretty fantastic performance across the board. It's got really decent response, really decent control, pretty good grip, good durability, really good durability, and it's a really great prop. It can be improved, but it's a really great prop, and I'll talk about the differences versus the Gemfan 3018 prop in a minute. But I want to point out that the weight distribution of this prop is what kind of sort of kills it a little bit for me. Not kills it, it just makes it a little bit not as ideal for me. The blade has a lot of weight in the actual blade. The hub is thick and whatever, is meaty, but the actual blade itself is relatively thick, so it's carrying a lot of weight at the end of the blades, and so that affects the response of the motor. As far as I can tell, I'm really just extrapolating based on a lot of experience testing these things and just coming up with theories from prop to prop. And the reason why I came up with that theory is because I compared these kinds of props compared to the 65mm props, which are smaller, 2.5 inch. I'm just talking about 3-inch props, and also these 76mm Tello props, which I'll get to in a second. But let's talk about the Gemfan 3018 prop that I helped develop with Gemfan. Very specifically, they did the whole design and everything. So these blades are 1.7 grams for a pair, so they're 5/10 or 5/100ths of a gram lighter than the HQ 3x2, but that's not where it matters most. The blade carries most of its weight in the center, center half, and so the outer half of the blade is very, very skinny and very, very thin and much, much lighter than the HU prop. And I know it's really just tenths of grams, but these little things, it seems to make a pretty significant difference. I mean, the plastic, or just the blade width, is thinner on the 3018, and also the plastic is just thinner at the very, very ends on the 3018, and the pitch on this blade is also a little bit less than the 3x2. I don't know if these numbers are accurate, but it does look less when you look at it head on. And so the resulting difference is that you get a much softer low end of the throttle, which is perfect for something that's really low weight, because that's what I intended this for, is for a quad that's relatively low weight for the size of the prop. And you get really good response, because not only is the shallower pitch easier to push through the air, so there's just less drag that the motor needs to work through, the blade is physically less weight as well. And these motors, while they are really powerful, they're making 400 or 500 grams of thrust, that's still not a lot of power to manage such a large prop. I mean, these motors are really small for these very, very large props. We're spinning the biggest prop that we can really fit with good control on these little 1303s and 1204 motors, or whatever other size motor that you're running. Keep that in mind, that these motors are really small for this huge prop that we're running. Traditionally, the 3-inch quads started out as like a 14 size motor. 1406 to 1408 was the size that 3-inch was, and then it kind of started going lower and lower and lower. The other thing that's very special about this prop is that it has a 2mm press fit shaft, and the 2mm press fit shaft is something that I didn't develop it. It's not really, it doesn't take much development. You just ask the manufacturer to make the shaft 2mm. So it's a 2mm shaft all the way through the motor. And what's special about this is that I hate screws. I hate using those stupid screws to T-mount the prop on. I like press fit because it's simple and it's easy, and I don't have to spend 10 minutes swapping my props out. So I went to 2mm because I was breaking 1.5mm. I mean, lots of people were breaking 1.5mm when you're not using the T-mount screws. So obviously, let's go to 2mm. And the idea here is that for the longest time, 5-inch quads were running 3mm steel shafts that were unhardened, and we didn't really have much problems. And the quads back then weighed more than they do now, 650, 700 grams for a 5-inch quad, and they were doing fine. So now we're running 100-gram quads with a 2mm shaft. Proportionally, that makes a lot of sense to me for this shaft not to break. Additionally, I'll show you how hard it is to get this prop off. Look, I can fold this blade in half before it comes off the motor. I've damaged the blade trying to get it off the motor. So if you think that this is going to come undone, it's not impossible for it to fall off, but it's definitely much more difficult. There's more surface area in the shaft to grip the blade than there is on a 1.5mm shaft. So the chances of you throwing this blade in flight is much, much less. It's almost zero. It's happened once to me in hundreds of flights, and it only happened in a crash, which probably just pushed the blade off. And it was also a blade that I had drilled the hole out on, so it wasn't like an actual manufactured blade. To get the blade off, you do have to spin it a bit and pull quite hard, not at the blades like I did, but just pull at the hub quite hard to get it off. And you can see that this shaft is nice and thick, and also there's no C-clip at the top down here, which would constrict the top of the shaft and potentially have a failure point in the shaft, making it narrower. And that's also very important. And so this mechanism works really, really nicely. And I'll move on after talking about stuff that I've done. Okay, so that's the 3018 prop, and that's my preferred prop because it's super nimble, super quick, super great response. It's not really designed for a high weight quad. It's designed for very low weight quads. It'll work okay on a high weight, and I am going to be testing it in a tri-blade, and the tri-blade is going to need a more substantial motor, and I will most likely make the tri-blade. I'll test it in for these little 12-0 whatever and 13-0 whatever motors, but it'll most likely need a 14 something size motor, and I'm going to be testing it probably with a 5mm shaft, or 5 or 6, whatever, the M6 or M5mm shaft for the regular props, the regular prop nut, because I think it's going to be more suitable for that status of a quad. Anyways, moving on. These are the Tello props, and I have two variations here. This one is from MyRC Mart, and there's like 4 or 5 different versions. So real quick, Tello is a company that somehow is associated with DJI. They are allowed to legitimately use DJI's branding and name on products that they make. I don't know why or what their relationship is. I've talked to the DJI engineers, and they don't even know what the relationship is, but somehow they've finagled their way into using DJI's branding, and they actually are sold. Sometimes I've seen them at Best Buy and like at the airports at like Brooks Store and whatever stores with the DJI branding, and their quads. Anyways, let's move on. These are the DJI Tello props, and they are kind of a shrunk down version of the larger Phantom props. These props are super interesting because they are 3-inch props, and they're super duper skinny, super duper lightweight. Let's weigh these props. This is 1.1 grams for this variant of the prop, and then there is another variant which is 1 gram. So this is even lighter. So this variant, I'll talk about this variant in a second, but this variant is polycarbonate. The blades are actually pretty durable. What's most surprising about this blade is that it has about the same load on the motor as a 65mm prop. Now, I haven't done any bench testing or anything to decide to figure that out. I've just threw them on 1103 motors that I know how they perform on 65mm props, and I was getting surprisingly good performance out of them because they have really good response, they got good control, everything is good about this prop as long as you keep the weight of the quad very, very low, well under 100 grams. Lower than 80 grams, this prop performs really well. And the difference between this prop and the 65mm prop is that if you think of a quad more like a plane with discs instead of spinning blades, and you kind of think of it as a glider, that's how this prop acts. So in turns, you not only get the thrust creation of the blade, but it also kind of feels like it's a wing, like scooping around a turn or coming down through a dive. So not only is this blade performing decently in all the categories, and it's producing some thrust, but you get an added, I'm guessing here, and I'm totally just trying to explain my sensation when I fly the thing and how I feel like it performs. When you're coming out of a dive and you give it full throttle, it tends to feel like you have more glide than you would normally on a 65mm prop. So a 65mm prop or a smaller blade, you just kind of rely on the thrust. With this larger blade, you're making that thrust more or less, you can't really tell, it's about the same maybe, but you also get that added extra bit of blade at the ends, which is acting kind of more like a glide plane and giving you this glide ability. Now, this version, this polycarbonate version, there's like 5 different versions of this prop. I've tested all of them, but I only have these 2 left. This polycarbonate version performs pretty well. It comes with an unfortunate 1mm shaft, which is a pain to drill out, and the hub is really annoyingly designed. This is actually the way HQ first designed the hub on the 65mm prop. It was just awful. So the hub is not very good, but the blade design is not bad. Now, this version is a glass nylon version, and it weighs even less than that. It's the lightest one. It's 1 gram. So these were 1.1 grams. This is 1 gram, and it's a glass nylon version. And if I flex this, it's actually a bit stiffer than the polycarbonate version, but the pitch is also slightly shallower looking on this blade, just the slightest hair shallower on this blade. And so the blade shape is also different. If you look at the winglets in the end, it's totally different shape. The performance of this glass nylon version is terrible. It's nowhere near as good as this version. I really wouldn't recommend this one to anybody at all, for any quad at all. It's just doesn't have any power, doesn't have any performance, doesn't work well. It's not even, I mean, I had to drill the holes out, but you can see where the hole is. That's legitimately where the hole was when I first got it. Like, the holes aren't even centered. It's just a very poor performing prop overall. Maybe it would perform better if it was legitimately the same exact mold as the other one, but hard to say. And the last prop I want to talk about is this the King Kong 75 millimeter prop. And this is the newest prop of the bunch. Surprisingly, it's not the heaviest one. It's actually 1.8 grams, so it's the same weight as the HQ 3x2, but the blade feels a bit stiffer on the King Kong prop. Now, I flew this on a couple quads. This is not a good performing prop at all. It's very zippy, like it just sounds very zippy, but it doesn't actually do anything. Doesn't feel like it really produces any thrust. And yeah, I wouldn't recommend this to anybody. Not a very good prop. Also, King Kong is a company that copies everybody, and if you look at the design of the center of this hub, that's actually designed from Rotor X, and I know Rotor X makes 3x2 also, which is don't have any left because they are so fragile, they break so easily. I know they're great for super light quads. I'll talk about them if I ever get a set and I can actually test them again against other quads or other props. But the center hub design here is from the Rotor X style, where it's narrow in the middle and then they have a little 1.5 millimeter hole in the middle. I mean, Rotor X did this because they designed their props to fit together as a quad blade or a twin blade, which was an ingenious idea back then. But if you try to run it in a twin blade configuration, the thing just cracks in half, and it's made of like glass nylon, so it's just trash in general to be used outside of its normal expected use of a quad blade with all 4 screws in the prop. So, I mean, they were super pioneers in this category, so kudos to them, but that's a long time past, and King Kong is still copying that old style for whatever reason. They just don't seem to have any imagination. Clearly, both HQ and Gemfan have realized newer methods of doing things, but regardless of that, this blade is polycarbonate, so it's not going to break at the hub, not going to break in the center, and you're probably going to use it with the T-mount screws anyways, because most people, for some reason, still like using those T-mount screws. But on 1.5 millimeter shaft, I would recommend using that. And yeah, just forget this prop. It's not any good at all. It doesn't have good grip, doesn't have good thrust, doesn't have good response. Nothing is good about it. It's got tons of weight out at the end of the blade. Nothing is good about this prop. So, to recap, use whatever you want, test everything you like, because these things are like a couple bucks each. I worked really hard on the 3018 prop. I think it's a fantastic prop. I'm going to be developing it a little bit further and testing it for tri-blade, maybe even a quad blade in the future. For now, it's performing really great on the little toothpick builds. It'll perform okay on heavier builds, but it's not ideal for heavier builds. I'll go over those a little bit later. I am working on slightly heavier builds. I do hope to see more 2 millimeter prop shaft props, as well as motors. The HQ 3x3x3 is a great prop. I really hope to see that in 2 millimeter shaft, as well as the HQ 65 millimeter and the HQ 3x2. I've asked Zong to make these in 2 millimeter press fit shafts, but I'm getting pushback from people. I'm waiting for people to start using all the thousands of motors that we've sold so far for them to realize that, hey, they're actually a whole lot better with the 2 millimeter press fit than wasting time with those annoying screws. Anyways, thanks for watching. Floss your teeth. Lots more coming. And something you may have noticed if you stuck around for this entire time is that this is a 3-inch original 1S toothpick, and I'm going to be working on this with either Beta FPV or Tiny Whoop. Jesse. I'm going to be talking to Jesse about this kind of category of stuff tomorrow, because it's really awesome to have something that's 1S and performs so spectacularly well. And with these new boards and motors and various things that are going on, that's possible, and it's really, really cool. So looking forward to things coming. Take care. Bye.